Good afternoon and welcome to the Centre for Social Justice. My name's Andy Cook and I am the Chief Executive here. The CSJ's job is to link the backstreets of this nation with the corridors of power, and in doing so give a voice to those who often struggle to get the audience, the attention and indeed the decisions they often deserve and need. So in this spirit I can think of no more important issue or people group or indeed time to hear about those currently suffering under modern slavery. This organisation, the Centre for Social Justice, has a very proud history in modern slavery work to date, working with many of those who are in this room. We've helped produce the first ever Modern Slavery Act and create the role of the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, which one day might get filled again, if we all keep our fingers crossed. But this was nearly 10 years ago now, and if a week is a long time in politics, try what a decade feels like. This is why a few years ago we set up a joint modern slavery unit here with our great friends Justice and Care, and it's great to see James here and all that you've achieved in Justice and Care, James. And ever since then we've been pumping out work with MPs from all sides of the House to try and get the attention and the ideas this issue deserves. Together we uncovered the fact that there's some 100,000 people in modern slavery in the UK nowadays, which is 10 times more than the official estimates say. And together we intervened, along with a bit of help from a BBC programme, in the evil of cuckooing, where criminals take over vulnerable people's homes and is at last likely to be recognised as a crime. And together we've shown time and time again, not that it was listened to the last few weeks, that it is the victims who hold the key to unlocking progress against criminal networks. So as the illegal migration bill has now been settled in Parliament and will get royal assent in the next few days, this threatens to unravel a lot of the hard work protections against modern slavery. And it tells us that we've got so much more work to do. And I know this is a fact that isn't lost on our guest speaker and great friend, Jess. Jess has been a huge champion for the victims of modern slavery in Parliament, shining a light on this wicked crime and challenging government on this and a number of other things as she goes. And all this comes from her life on the front line supporting victims of modern slavery. She knows of what she speaks. And now Jess is involved in perhaps one of the most important job interviews going, as her party tries to take power in Westminster. And I know all of us here want to know what she would do with power if she had the next 10 years. After we've heard from Jess, we'll open up to a load of questions from the floor, which Tatiana, our brilliant head of modern slavery, will chair. So get your questions ready. And on behalf of the Centre for Social Justice and of Justice and Care, and anyone else who has justice in their headline title, and with great thanks to our supporters, Savannah Wisdom, who've made today possible, please give a warm welcome to Jess.
I've got a radio mic on, but I'm not a taller man. I'm quite a tall woman. So I just want to start by saying that, you know, maybe this wouldn't always have been considered to my Marxist father to be my natural home here at the CSJ offices. But I just want to pay massive tribute to the people who work here, because actually in the entire time since I have been elected to Parliament, it has been the people in this office who have really tried to drive policy on modern slavery when it felt like others had it had been forgotten, or bigger issues in the safeguarding space took over the media headlines following the killing of Sarah Everard, for example, the problems in the Metropolitan Police. It has never been forgotten in these offices, and they have sought never ever to let policymakers forget what we had all planned to do together. And so I start my remarks with a huge thanks, especially to Tatiana, who emails me, and Louise, who both who email me on a near daily basis. So thanks for that. So I want to start by looking back. It would be crass of me to suggest anything but the significant progress that was made under the leadership of the former Prime Minister, Theresa May, who made fighting modern slavery one of her absolute core priorities. She remains, I am pleased to say, dedicated to that, voting against her own party this week, one noted, which is a big thing. I don't think we should underestimate what a big thing that is for a former Prime Minister to do. I mean, especially if it's Theresa May. Had it been Boris Johnson, it's just Tuesday. In 2015, the Modern Slavery Act marked a turning point in the fight against slavery and human trafficking and set the UK as a global leader in tackling this horrendous crime. But even before the Act finally passed into law, we saw a new level of commitment to support services with the creation of a network of support providers up and down the country. And as I stand in front of you today, I see some of those who were involved at the time in designing a national support response to human trafficking in what seemed like, at the time, endless meetings at the Ministry of Justice, because that's who had it at first, if anyone can remember that far back, and then latterly the Home Office. I think of the minute, detailed thinking we did about the specifications for refuges, down to the safety standards on the door locks that we would put into refuge, which led to weeks, I'm not even joking, weeks of debate. I remember spending the time late at night sewing the curtains for what would become the Midlands' first dedicated women's refuge for victims of trafficking. I remember the care we put into that service, with the service staff sleeping overnight in the property before we put the offer out to others, in order to make sure that the neighbourhood was safe from antisocial behaviour or wasn't a hotspot for prostitution that would threaten the people who had already suffered so much, who we were going to place there. My God, we took making a place of safety really seriously back then. I think now of victims of modern slavery boarding an overcrowded barge in Portland and in Dorset, and I cry at the difference in standards to what we once aspired to, and now what awaits people who have been beaten, imprisoned, terrified, and sexually exploited. Who is sewing the curtains now? Modern slavery is a crime that is happening up and down our country, with British as well as foreign national men, women and children being forced into sex, labour and criminal activity, like growing cannabis or county lines drug dealing across the UK. It is entrenched in our communities and is bringing harm to thousands of people each year, as Andy said, hundreds of thousands more than the data allows us to see. When many of us here sat through all those planning and training meetings all those years ago, we were driven by the hope of stopping this trade, supporting the victims, and educating the public about these evils. It was a noble ambition, and one which has not yet been realised. 8 years later, despite increased awareness and understanding, the organised crime networks behind modern slavery are continuing to act with impunity, if not worse than they ever have before. The number of possible victims of modern slavery found in the UK keeps growing consistently year on year. This should not in and of itself be seen as a complete failure, but is, I hope, to see it as a sign that we know and understand more about the crime and are able to spot the signs of exploitation and help victims break the cycle of abuse. Last year, 16,938 potential victims were identified and referred to the National Referral Mechanism for support, a 33% increase on the previous year. Yet the government-funded support system for victims of slavery is failing, with many victims unable to access the support that they need. Those that the government do support find themselves stuck for 1.5 years on average waiting for a government decision whether they believe that person was trafficked or not. Even when the answer is positive and possible victims are being recognised as genuine, they have no further rights to longer-term support to help their reintegration or their cooperation with the police. Under the proposed illegal migration bill, which now very much seems a reality, the government is now going even further in denying access to support for those victims who entered the UK illegally. This is exactly how traffickers operate. They often smuggle their victims and use fear of deportation and debt bondage to coerce them into exploitation in the UK. I'm reminded of one woman from West Africa who we supported in our West Midlands refuge. Every morning, when her support worker would arrive for the day, she would find this woman who had been kept in both domestic and sexual servitude, tidying away her bed from the living room floor of the refuge. When she was challenged about why she was not sleeping in the bed in the private room provided to her, she said she had not yet done enough for her to deserve the privilege of a bed. Her own room was not something she had ever had in her life, and so culturally she found it a challenge. However, it was that she felt she hadn't earned it yet that was so harrowing to hear. I tell this story as a means to get people to understand exactly how successful the grooming of a human being can be, how long it can take for coercion of an abuser to be shaken off. Traffickers are today showing their slaves images of where they will end up in detention, on a mega barge, or deported home right back to those who trafficked them in the first place. We can all, with our rational brains in this room, think that it wouldn't work on us, but none of us is so conditioned as to think that we would sleep in discomfort on a floor until we had earned the right for comfort. Believe me when I say that the illegal migration bill is a trafficker's dream, a tool for their control. But that is not all that has changed in the last decade. In the development of modern slavery services, something else we weren't expecting, something that was never accounted for, never planned in, and none of the systems in those many meetings were designed for it, and that was the rise of British victims of trafficking that the system would need to handle. From 2017 to 2021, British nationals were consistently the top nationality of potential victims of slavery referred for support to the National Referral Mechanism. In 2022, the number of British potential victims identified was the highest since records began. 1 in 4 of possible victims found in the UK last year were British nationals. 1 in 5 a British child. Yet as the research shows, many still go unidentified as they are not recognised to be trafficked and exploited within the borders of their motherland. British nationals have some of the most complex needs: mental health issues, drug and alcohol dependencies. They come from very vulnerable backgrounds and need specialist support. It is our duty to help them break the cycle of exploitation and find a path for recovery. Yet only 194 convictions were served in 2022 under the Modern Slavery Act on an all-offence basis, with only 43 of those on a principal offence basis. Criminals are literally walking away with impunity. Surely we can do better than this. Remember for a minute the story I told of the West African woman. Remember how she had been entitled to be supported in safe accommodation. Back then, we didn't ask her how she arrived. We just rescued her and helped her. Well, I'm afraid that situation is not the same for British victims. That is a system we should not be proud of. Here is a letter from a young British woman I have supported. Like many young women I have supported who've been made into modern slaves by criminal and grooming gangs, she has expressed how coming forward for help made her life harder, not safer. This is the letter that Isabel wrote to the Home Secretary in February this year. Dear Suella Braverman, following on from your statement on the 2nd of April, apologies, it was April, not February, in April 2023, I am writing this letter as a victim who has been let down by countless professionals and services, but worryingly, by the Home Office itself. I will begin by providing a summary of my experiences. I was groomed at age 13, and then this led to me experiencing sexual and criminal exploitation for over a decade, whereby I was trafficked all around the country and sold from one gang to another. There were countless times where I was gang raped, injected with heroin, and left black and blue. I was exposed to serious and organised crime, and my perpetrators would laugh at how they continued getting away with what they were doing to me and so many other girls. I did not see any of my family for years, and my childhood and early adulthood was stolen from me. Whilst I acknowledge your statement that you vow to stamp out child grooming gangs, this is a very easy statement to make. Victims of this crime all around the country have heard it all before. Although you've announced new measures to tackle the issue, it makes me question how this is achievable when there are so many flaws in the system already in place, such as the National Referral Mechanism. The police did not refer me into the National Referral Mechanism, despite them full well knowing I had been trafficked. I have spoken with several police officers over the years who do not know what the NRM even is, let alone know that they are first responders. It took 562 days for me to get my conclusive grounds decision, and for most of that time, I continued to be exploited. Nearly a year ago, I was sitting in a hotel paid for by the police after I'd been physically and sexually assaulted. My accommodation was not safe, and I had requested a safe house. After a lot of back and forth, I was eventually told that a safe house was not an option, as I was a British national, and that I should just go to my local authority for housing options. I had to return to unsafe accommodation to then be raped and physically assaulted again. I spent days and days in police interviews going into as much detail as I possibly could, with the hope that I would get justice and the men who had tortured me would end up behind bars. The reality is so many victims like me must drop out of investigations because we are not safeguarded, resulting in thousands of perpetrators on the streets continuing to exploit and intimidate vulnerable children and adults. If possible, imagine you are at a police station as a victim of this crime and a stream of text messages comes through to your phone from your perpetrators saying that they know where you are and that if you do not leave, they will kill you and your family. This is just one example of a threat I have received. This is not going to stop until appropriate measures are put in place to protect us. In the meantime, the trauma victims experience at the hands of their exploiters is exacerbated when we are routinely let down by the so-called systems in place to protect us. I haven't even covered in this letter the battles we face accessing support for our mental health. I do hope that you read this letter and that it provides you with an opportunity to reflect on the example of someone who has experienced failures from the Home Office. Yours sincerely, Isabel. Obviously, her name is not Isabel. So, we have prescribed the problem. What do we need to do next? While the Modern Slavery Act set the foundation, 8 years on, modern slavery remains a low-risk, high-reward crime. Political leadership has waned to almost nothing. This means modern slavery is no longer seen as a priority. Modern slavery has been moved into being an immigration issue under stewardship of the immigration minister, who, funnily enough, I just walked past on the way here. I didn't mention, I should have invited him along. Which is really helpful to victims like Isabel, isn't it, that it's become an immigration issue. Where will we deport her to if she fails to comply with police action due to the lack of support? Will we send her to Bury St Edmunds? It is time for a new drive towards eradicating modern slavery and exploitation. Fresh political leadership is needed. We need to inject new momentum into the fight against modern slavery and shift the balance of risk and reward so criminals can no longer profit from human misery. Firstly, we need a strong cross-departmental strategic plan and action. Health, housing, education, local government, business and trade, all these departments have a big role to play in the fight against this brutal crime, not just the Home Office and the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. I would argue Isabel should never really have ever had to interact with the Home Office in reality. She should have been provided housing, social care, support, and yet if you were to speak to the vast majority of these institutions, the vast majority of people wouldn't know what the National Referral Mechanism even was. Secondly, we must refocus on the core of the fight against this horrendous abuse on our doorstep, bringing offenders to justice and supporting victims to recover. We need to get tougher on all modern slavery offenders. For too long, too many people have got away with enslaving both adults and children. A strategic criminal justice approach is needed to hold slavery offenders to account. Police, CPS and the judiciary have to be equipped properly to work hand in glove in bringing traffickers behind bars. However, we can't get to traffickers without survivors. This is often the missing piece of the puzzle, where we need their testimony to get anywhere close to conviction. Supporting them well enables survivors to participate in justice, and anyone who tells you otherwise, which I'm afraid to say many ministers have stood and basically tried to insist on recently, is lying. I've seen firsthand, working in these support services, how we have no chance of achieving justice outcomes and a safer country without supporting victims of modern slavery through their journey. Isabel, for example, failed again and again for a whole decade, and throughout her life will never see her offenders behind bars. To support survivors of slavery, we need to see them as victims of crime and adopt a safeguarding approach to how we treat them. All too often, we are still criminalising them. We do not have a definition in law currently, for example, for child criminal exploitation, nor of adult sexual exploitation. There is no definition in law, there is no government strategy for adult sexual exploitation. I did check that when somebody first brought that to me, because I couldn't believe it, and yet it is true. Despite the many years of reforming the National Referral Mechanism, which was designed to support victims of slavery, it is a broken system that needs to be fixed. A challenging and complicated task, but key in order to get victims of modern slavery on their journey towards resilience and recovery. But it is not just the NRM that has a role to play. Statutory services need to be more responsive, ensuring safe accommodation for victims from the moment of rescue, and applying a multi-agency approach to victim identification and support, similar to that of a multi-agency risk assessment conference approach that we use in domestic abuse. I could also give a whole speech about how that doesn't work that well either, but it's certainly better than what they've got for modern slavery, which is just non-existent in most local areas. Justice is part of recovery for many victims. Some say it is the moment of closure for them and a time to move on finally. However, not many victims see justice done. The process is far too long and complicated for them to engage in. In those rare cases that justice is done and traffickers are convicted, they do not seem to get sentencing anywhere commensurate with the level of harm done by enslaving their fellow human beings. Meaningful long-term support is needed to empower survivors to engage with the police and see their traffickers being put behind bars. Support like that offered by Justice and Care Victim Navigator programmes is a real example of how successful prosecutions and convictions can be achieved by putting victim support front and centre. Thirdly, we must focus our efforts on prevention of trafficking and re-trafficking. Prevention is crucial to ensure that modern slavery is not given a chance to flourish. Tackling modern slavery at source and in transit countries must remain a priority for the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. In particular, programmes addressing underlying vulnerabilities to modern slavery exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic in key source countries and the global hotspots. However, we also need to prioritise prevention here in the UK. We must stop the cycle of abuse and exploitation endured by British nationals, most of whom are highly vulnerable British children. Targeting earlier intervention programmes aiming to identify and support vulnerable children before they fall prey to the criminals needs to be developed and implemented, working with schools and local authorities. Equally, we need to work with families to address the risk of exploitation and equip them with the necessary tools to spot risky behaviours and where to seek help. This week alone, I have had to complain to 2 different local authority children's services teams who are seeking to penalise parents desperate for help for their exploited sons and daughters. This is happening everywhere. This is the same as what happens in domestic abuse services. If you show an element of victimhood in your family, immediately we go to attacking the mother in this situation, isolating people from the support that they could get, blaming her usually, for the exploits that their children are suffering rather than helping them navigate. Last but not least, businesses must step up their game. With more than 27 million people suffering from forced labour around the world, companies and governments should do more to address forced labour in their supply chains. The UK has been seen as a global leader in this area. Now, as other countries have followed suit, the UK needs to make further steps to strengthen transparency, reporting to tackle slavery in business supply chains, alongside introducing mandatory due diligence legislation and controls to prohibit the import of goods produced abroad via modern slavery. This would be game-changing for the world, and we have a responsibility to do it. What I would like to see in 10 years' time, I would like a break actually, in 10 years' time. I've got about 10 years left, that's it. I'm done then. My vision for the next 10 years, I suppose, is robust legislation that protects victims and punishes the perpetrators. We cannot just continue to rest on the pretty big laurels of the Modern Slavery Act. You know, it was pretty good. It needs some more work. A government working jointly with private and third sector, driven by the same mission of ridding Britain of slavery. More criminal networks dismantled, with more traffickers serving the punishment they deserve for enslaving their fellow human beings, with their assets being confiscated. This is what will hurt them the most. A safeguarding approach to supporting victims of modern slavery through a system that picks up a victim from the moment of identification and nurtures them towards recovery and justice. Education and prevention programmes embedded in schools and other education settings, and local authority child social services to protect vulnerable children from falling prey to traffickers. It'd be good if we could keep hold of the kids that we put in hotels as well. That might end some trafficking if we just, you know, a head count. UK businesses leading the global effort in eradicating forced labour and slavery in supply chains. Modern slavery becoming a high-risk and low-reward crime in the UK. Too often, the headlines on grooming and trafficking do nothing for the front line. Our country has a proud history on legislating in the space of modern slavery. It cannot be a political football in the battle about immigration. I cannot sit and listen to another minister misunderstand the data on modern slavery, the system of the national referral mechanism, and to roundly forget that British people are the ones they are talking about in a debate about boats. I don't often want to walk in Theresa May's shoes because they look really uncomfortable and frankly more expensive than I can afford. But I do want to see is myself reunited with so many of the people that she brought together who a decade ago felt that we had a moment to change things. I'll go back to the boring meetings about locks on doors. Let's pick up that challenge again. It is a new and changing challenge, but one that deserves our detailed attention, not merely an excuse for a good headline.
Well, wow. What a speech, and thank you
really
so
hot.
much. Yeah, thank you so much,
sorry.
Jess, for all you've done so far, for your soul in that speech, and your hope that you've given us today. I think especially this week, as we see the legal migration bill going through, and in these difficult times, I think we all need that hope and injection that you've given us today to carry all of us forward for the next 10 years. And I hope it's going to be a historic moment that 10 years down the line we'll be able to look back.
Yeah, we did some more.
And we did more work. So thank you so much for your inspirational speech. I will use my chair's prerogative to ask the first question, if I may, and then we'll open the floor for more questions. So, Jess, if you were to become a minister responsible for modern slavery, what would your 3 top priorities be for the first year?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I'd bring it out of being in the Department for Immigration for a start off. So First of all, I'll wrestle it back off Stephen Kinnock in this imagined future. Although I have to say, my colleagues in the Home Office team, Holly and Stephen, have walked completely lockstep with me in this particular fight. But yes, it needs to be wrestled back to where it started as being a safeguarding issue within the Home Office. I think within the first year, look, I mean, who knows what the world is going to look like if the Labour Party wins, and what is going to be possible within the first 5 years, let alone the first year. But even without having a resource-based conversation, there needs to absolutely be first of all, a push to start a piece of legislation that we have actually been promised. So I'm assuming someone in the department's written it already, because we were promised modern slavery legislation specifically about supply chains and global issues. So first of all, trying to get that back into the cycle. But then secondly, a whole-scale review of how the national referral mechanism works for the different categories of modern slavery victim. I think that my main experience of the problems with the NRM, and it's by no means perfect for anyone, but it's absolutely not perfect for children, and it's not perfect for British people. It's not serving British people or children. It wasn't really ever designed for them, as we remember from being in those original design meetings. That it was never really, you know, when we were back then trying to do a brilliant thing, in our heads, and back then as well, the vast majority were women who were trafficked into the country, and the highest reason was sex. And that changing profile from the time when the National Referral Mechanism was designed, it's stupid that we're trying to, you know, sort of bastardise the current system to one that is for modern times. So that absolutely needs to be done. I think then the next thing that I would do is try to make somebody in the department for whatever it's going to be called this week, levelling up local government, housing, local councils, have somebody who's responsible, a minister who has some sort of ministerial responsibility for people with vulnerabilities, including modern slavery, in the very first instant. Also, I think defining adult sexual exploitation in the law is quite important, and child criminal exploitation in the law. We've tried to put it into the Victims Bill in the last 2 weeks. The government rejected it both times, but they've got the summer to come back and tell us if they're going to do it. But yeah, I think that there does need to be, I hate to say, like, you know, that we're going to do like redesigny stuff, but actually in this space, I actually think a redesign is what is needed.
Thank you, Jess. You can definitely count on us.
Yeah, don't you worry, you'll be doing all the work, Tatiana.
Not that I'm seeking for promotion, but I should have done this first, actually, a bit of housekeeping. So please keep your questions succinct. Let's not make statements, but actually ask questions.
Oh, God, like the Labour Party conference. Literally no one at the Labour Party conference has ever asked a question, ever.
So today is all about questions.
It's never happened.
Wait for the mic, please, before you speak, because we have live stream, as you know. And I would like to ask if any media is here to ask the first question, please. If not, we'll just move on. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. I'm so hot. I'm so a woman of a certain age.
Hi. Is this working? Yeah. Hi, Jess. So Sophie Huskisson from the Daily Mirror. So you obviously mentioned a lot about children, child criminal exploitation. You probably know where I'm going. So
I do know where you're going. It's nothing to do with trafficking, but go for it.
But children are much more vulnerable to all sorts of risks: modern slavery, child criminal exploitation, county lines, when they're in poverty. Obviously, Keir Starmer this weekend said that he was no longer going to scrap the two-child benefit cap. I just wondered what you make of that, where Labour can go further in this. Obviously, I know it's about fiscal responsibility, but
I would like
money
the moon on a
can
stick.
be found in different places. Say with Rishi Sunak last week, he managed to find £1 billion for
didn't he
public
just?
sector pay.
And
Yes.
has anybody asked him where he found that from? I noticed that he doesn't get asked the same questions. But what I would say is...
They never give us questions.
They never let you ask them questions, no. He'd just tell you what his pledges were. Sorry, I shouldn't slag off the Prime Minister quite so badly, but he's rubbish at answering questions. So the first thing I would say is that if I'd been making the speech that I just made in 1997, or even 2001 or 2005, I would have announced a huge amount of things that have money attached to them that I'd vitally needed in, although I think that, to be honest, there's a huge amount of money wasted in the national referral mechanism, leaving people waiting for years. So there's definitely money to be found in this particular space. But I would definitely be talking about resources. But the country has been left in a situation where we don't have as much coming in as we have going out. We are currently spending more money servicing our debt than we spend on schools. We spend more money on debt than on schools. So until I can know for certain that all the families in my constituency won't be hit again by a massive boom in their mortgage or their rent, then I think it would be crass of the Labour Party to be making £1 billion here, £1 billion there, without finding a way to pay for it. What I find objectionable, actually, about this sort of particular, not you, about this becoming now the issue that the Labour Party is having to answer to, is if it's the Labour Party's policy to have a two-child policy, this is the Tories' policy, and it is not something that I wish to defend. It's not something that I voted for. I certainly didn't. The idea that Keir Starmer doesn't want to stop children living in poverty is for the birds. Of course he does. But we live in the situation. I skin the cat that I've been given, and I've been given a broken, mangy cat by this government. And so, yeah, unfortunately, obviously, it's actually not necessarily true, even what you say about how children in poverty end up in this situation. It's actually, as I can see all the experts in the room, there is lots and lots of examples, I'm afraid to say, of where poverty doesn't play a part in it. So Isabel, the example that I read out, for example, is by no means somebody who lived in child poverty. And actually sometimes I think that with the interventions that we have in cases of domestic abuse, sexual violence and modern slavery, is that we focus them all on the issue of the impoverished, and we miss people very, very badly from the system, and that definitely needs renewing.
Thank you, Jess. Shall we now move to the floor? So we've got 3 hands up, 4 hands up. Oh, 5. I'm going to go to Kate Roberts first, and Philippa and James.
Thank you. So Kate Roberts, and I work for Focus on Labour Exploitation, or FLEX. And I was really pleased to hear what you said about prevention. And I was thinking about, well, also, as you mentioned, there was the promised modern slavery and supply.
You can kiss that goodbye now, I think. I don't think it's coming.
So what I wanted to ask about was what would your, were the Labour Party to win the election, and this was within your remit, what would your views be around short-term visas? I know you've done a lot of work around the overseas domestic worker visa.
I have indeed.
There's also you may or may not know about the horticultural seasonal worker visa.
I once had to do a response about daffodils
So
when Stephen was off.
Short-term, 6-month-long visas,
Yes.
where workers are coming from all around the world to work in the UK, often paying very high migration costs. And then once they get here, obviously, if you're a worker on a 6-month visa, it's very hard to raise a complaint in practice, access
100%.
any sort of normal labour market complaint system, an employment tribunal.
Very difficult.
Obviously, if your immigration sponsor is also your employer, plus the time frames.
The government said something about bricklayers and things as well yesterday, didn't they? So, you know, there is the concern for me, I'd say.
So we're certainly concerned that this is moving in the direction of a 2-tier workforce. So certain workers who are unable to exercise rights in practice.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, look, I think that one of the, I mean, not so much ever that I particularly, I mean, I largely, when working in the field, worked with women and children, not exclusively, but largely with women and children. Latterly, I suppose, the county lines issue, which, funnily enough, no one who's affected by it calls it. the issue of labour exploitation was not what was one, apart from domestic servitude, as you said, I've done quite a lot of work in that space, that ever came up as much because there were other services under the Salvation Army contract that dealt much more with men's labour. But I am very, very concerned. I mean, the Labour Party has already expressed real concerns about the idea of undercutting wages, about the visa lists that allow people to come in that undercut British people's wages, and the short-term nature. I worry desperately about short-term visas being given to people who then nobody really knows what happens to them. And I'm afraid to say the data, the literal base of the data for who comes into our country and where they are is zero. Like, so we wouldn't even know what was happening. And whilst I did once have to do a statement and become an expert on daffodils in 5 minutes, from Birmingham I don't know a lot about farming, but I buy daffodils for cheap, so I'm almost certainly part of the problem. I was very, very concerned at there being a real there is a real conservative push from rural communities about having these short-term visa options. I think that we're not going to get rid of that while we have a supply problem. But what we have to make sure of is that there is proper regulation and proper systems put in place for them to be properly reporting. There has to be workers' rights for those people that they feel that they actually can access. Now, the problem for domestic servitude, the problem in domestic servitude is that their only option is to go through the NRM. That is, the problem is that we make victims of trafficking out of people who are just being exploited for their labour. Like, if a British person was being exploited for their labour, they would be, they would be able to go either to their union, to the tribunal, there's various other forms. And actually, victims of domestic servitude, or not actually, victims of domestic servitude are victims of human trafficking, but women whose immigration falls out of place because they basically had a horrible posh boss. I honestly never knew that domestic service was a thing until I moved to London. Not something we have in Birmingham. I had to have it explained to me that posh people have people living in their houses and treat them badly. But the problem is that we turn them, the immigration system turns them into victims of modern slavery. Now, if Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman wanted to see the number of people going through the modern slavery system go down, they could absolutely be looking at the workers' rights in the space of people on short-term visas, because we are pushing the wrong people through the NRM at the moment. And they shouldn't be there. There should be a different system of workers' rights for people on short-term visas. We shouldn't make victims of human trafficking out of them, because it's not the same. We need to clean up the businesses, not send those people to prison for trafficking if that's not what they're doing. And so that is what I would seek to do in that particular space.
Thank you, Jess. Mindful of the time, I'd like to move to a question to Philippa.
I'm Philippa Roberts from Hope for Justice. And
I love a bit of hope for justice. Well done.
I do too. I just want to say thank you so much for what you've said today. I don't know about other people, but I think you've really given us hope today in what is a really difficult...
for justice.
Even hope for justice.
What I hope to have given you.
I just wanted to ask, with so many different social issues to address, in terms of if there's a new Labour government, is there space for this issue in that whole genre of so many things?
It is absolutely a good question to ask. And the problem with modern slavery is that, I mean, funnily, it's a paradoxical problem, because the problem with modern slavery is that it sits alongside, in this particular space, of sexual violence and domestic abuse. Now, I'm pretty proud of myself for this, and the others who were involved. We really have made that a political issue that sits now front and centre in a sort of, people care about it now. The public want to hear answers. We want to talk about the failings, and it has, it for example, forms like, one of the Labour Party's key missions, and I'm incredibly proud of that. Modern slavery, weirdly, always will feel like it is going to play second fiddle to that, and that is a real, very, very pertinent risk. Then, paradoxically, modern slavery is the only one that has a nationalised contract that is run by a government department. So, in other ways, it has much more secure funding for the support service. Actually, much more Much better identification in the data, notwithstanding what has been pointed out about the data underestimating. And so while it has this departmental hold on it, I think it will always have some element of policy drive that punches way above its weight. Because even if you were to compare the numbers between this and domestic abuse, I mean, it can't hold a candle to it, can it? But I mean, if you compare this to terrorism, and nothing holds a candle to that in how big that is in policy terms, definitely, what I would say is we have to make it so that modern slavery becomes an issue, not dissimilar to terrorism, that is seen as such a high priority in that particular space, in basically the security space and the NCA space. Because it is always going to play second fiddle to domestic abuse and sexual violence in the safeguarding space. But I mean, I really, really deeply care about it. I am going to try and get some other people to join that. And Holly and Stephen, as I said, are both real champions of this particular thing. And Carolyn Harris, you know, and I mean, IDS, there's never a day he's not texting me about which things we might rebel on and whether we're voting on this or the other. And unless he loses his seat, which then, you know, there will always be. And the good thing about modern slavery is, I tell you where the place that defends it the most, the Lords. The House of Lords is full of people who really, really, really give a toss about this. I'm sorry, but the Labour Party have said that they're going to get rid of that. Just realised I've undone the good thing I said about the House of Lords. But yeah, it will be hard, I won't lie. And so it's going to be on the people in this room to work really hard to make sure that that doesn't happen.
This is exactly what I wanted to say. It's really all on us to make sure that it doesn't slip down.
Yeah, it is.
Absolutely
So
agree.
if we, third question is gone, but we've got a hand up behind, and one more.
Hi, it's boiling, isn't it? Yeah, it's Craig Melson from Tech UK. We're the trade body for tech firms. It's really interesting what you're saying about mandatory due diligence. It's the Labour Party position that the UK will adopt a mandatory due diligence approach, because our members will be up for that. We're all getting ready for the EU one anyway. And,
while you're there, just pop this one in,
and I was on a multi-sector thing with the government this week, where lots of different sectors from different reps from different industries, and we're like, well, we're all getting ready for the EU one. We're already prepped for that, so the UK shouldn't fall behind and should adopt that approach. So if you were to introduce mandatory due diligence for global supply chains, I think we'll be up for that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's going to take a legislative programme to do that, which, you know, when I first was elected, I thought would take 6 months, and then I realised it will take 7 years to get any piece of legislation through anywhere. But yes, absolutely. I mean, it seems ridiculous that they're doing it, and we would have been doing it, of course, if things had been different. So yeah, like, I mean, it will be worked through over a long period of time with British business. But yeah, I mean, I think that I can't just have companies turning a blind eye to the fact that they're profiteering from slavery. And as we move into a new global race, if you will, around green technology, there's quite a lot of questions to answer about where we get some of that green technology from in the world and how it manages to make it to our shores. That, you know, I think there's some big conversations over the next couple of years about those particular things.
Thank you so much. Now, I've been reminded that time is slipping through, and we really have time for just 2 more questions.
Because I wang on a lot.
So we've got a hand up here, please, and then that. Okay, Rachel, I can't say no to you. 3 more questions, but I promise I'll cut down my closing remarks.
Great, I'll be brief as well. Thanks. So Matt Crossman, I'm the Stewardship Director for Rathbones Group, we're a 4350 company. You mentioned the vital role that businesses must play in bringing these issues to light, and we couldn't agree more. Investors really want that too. Our current coalition has over 130 global investors at about $8 trillion in assets under management supporting action. So we've had Section 54 of the Act bringing thousands of companies to the table with basic reporting on modern slavery, but we know that at least 5,000 have never actually produced a
Done it.
statement.
Yeah.
So what could an incoming Labour government do to give that, what we already have, teeth without having to
Yeah,
re-legislate?
I mean, there's quite a lot in legislation that seems good on the face of it, but, you know, like gender reporting of salaries and things, it's not massively changed anything to do with whilst it's good on paper, I think that we are going to have to look, I mean, without putting in place, you know, huge regulators who are going to go through masses and masses of data that would be very, very costly, and unless they have teeth, I mean, have you ever tried to complain to a regulator? I love it when politicians come up with, let's make a better regulator for this. There is never a day goes by when I'm not complaining about how a regulator is useless and has no teeth. So look, I think that we would have to consult with businesses to see what level of essentially thumb screws. And what I find in other areas of work where I work with businesses to change their policies on various things to do with safeguarding and workplace practices is that there are some who want to go so far, like the extra mile, and be made such good examples of how well they are doing it. And then there are others who totally resist absolutely any sort of slight change. I think that it's really for us to work with yourselves to find out what teeth is it going to take, rather than me just sitting here and saying, I'm going to shut your company down if you don't do exactly what I say at every moment. I'm not going to do that because, you know, they employ quite a lot of my constituents. I think we've got to find a balance, though, in how we make the things that are brilliant that are written into our laws at the moment with regard to workers' rights actually mean something. Whether it's a tribunal system, whether it's as it would be in other things, I just think that needs to be designed alongside with business because it isn't working at the moment. You're right.
Thank you so much, Luke and Rachel, and we'll have to call it a day.
Luke was very eager.
He was.
Luke was the most eager questioner.
Yeah, Luke de Pulford, until recently ran the anti-slavery charity Arise. Is Labour going to reform UK prostitution laws to address demand for sexual exploitation? I know it's something you care about personally. So
it really is something that I care about personally. Well, the first and foremost thing that I'm going to do with regard to adult sexual exploitation is create a strategy, define it in law and create a strategy. One of the main problems that we see in modern slavery is, and they absolutely don't consider themselves to be victims of modern slavery at all, not at all. They would never ever use those words, is women with complex needs. And so I'm the chair of a group of charities up in the northeast who are looking at exactly how we get agencies to better understand that routes to prostitution, routes to criminality. I mean, it's not new news. It's basically everything that was written in the Corsten Review about 20 years ago. It's not new news. But there has been very little in the way of complex needs accommodation, for example, complex needs support services. So most women who go into a refuge because they've been beaten, abused, sexually assaulted on the street or at home, who have a drug problem, they can't go into your average women's refuge. If you've got very, very severe mental health problems, you can't go into your average women's refuge. If you've got failing immigration status, you can't go into your average. So there's all sorts of complex needs environment that are misserved. And that would absolutely make a cracking change to victims of adult sexual exploitation if we just did some of that work. My personal view, and it is my personal view, not the view of the Labour Party, is that I am wholly against the prostitution of adults and children, and I think that people who do it are sexually exploiting them and should be criminalised as such. That is my view. Whether that is where the Labour Party ends up in a legislative framework is yet to be seen, and that will be a debate that will be had quite fiercely within the Labour Party. But it is absolutely my view that people who sexually, if you knowingly, I mean, the women who I served in the refuge, in a sort of liberal argument about how prostitution's always going to exist, well, so is rape, but I still think that should be criminalised. I hate the idea that people knowingly go and have rape women who've been, and men, lots of very vulnerable drug addicted men, and think that it's part of like liberal society. Not to me, it's not.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you, Luke. The last question, Rachel, please.
Hello, thank you very much for your speech, which did give us all hope to hear this from the political sector. I wanted to ask you, I'm from the Helen Bamber Foundation, where we work with survivors to provide a multidisciplinary programme of care for them for as long as they need. And I have to ask you whether the issue of automatic leave to remain for at least a year for people who get a positive conclusive identification can happen, because while that is not in place, it is a glaring vulnerability to re-trafficking. We see this on the ground all the time, and other issues related to the fact that when support drops, traffickers move in, and it's a key vulnerability for traffickers. So just wanted to ask you whether you are committing to...
I'm absolutely not going to commit to that now, but I will. What I am definitely going to do, if elected, is look at how we use with vulnerable groups the ILR, essentially, and the passageway through to ILR and citizenship. Because, I mean, we've been arguing, I've moved the amendment now more times than I've had bloody hot dinners around women who are victims of domestic violence who are not brought on a spousal visa, being sent home and not being given the same route. So the domestic violence concession route, which allows a route towards ILR and destitution funding essentially for 6 months, 3 months actually. It usually rolls over to be about 6 months when everything comes out in the wash, is something that is a model that has to be looked at across the board when we're talking about vulnerable people who've come from other countries, not just those in cases of domestic abuse, and that is absolutely something that there will be a sort of whole-scale review on, and it will entirely come down more than anything else to budgets and all of those things, the restrictions on those sorts of things. But yeah, the system of how we treat destitution in cases of criminal exploitation and abuse needs to all be linked up together. And in answer to your question, linking human trafficking in with some of, you know, the broader, and so that's what we have sought to do recently in the domestic abuse bill or in the victims bill. Like, we're constantly trying to write the word and victims of modern slavery into other legislation that is about things that people understand and get better, so that there's a sort of coattails situation that can happen. And certainly how we manage destitution in the year after coming forward in cases of domestic sexual violence and modern slavery in cases of people with unsettled immigration status is one that we will absolutely work towards flattening out and making the best that can be afforded.
So you can look at it as part of the review.
I would absolutely look at with the NRM. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. But it's a broad problem across the board. Like, if you're raped and you come forward, you might be deported before. I mean, you wouldn't, because no one actually gets deported. It's just a thing that they write about. Like, you know, your court case will take 7 years, and like, imagine a multiple. So the example of both the women I spoke about in my speech, they would have gangs with multiple perpetrators, multiple victims. You think that court case is finishing within a year of being allowed to stay here? I mean, you'd be lucky if you get the charge within the first year. You're talking a 10-year wait on a multiple gang, you know. That's, I mean, some of what I'm saying about how we have to update the systems that we put in place for the situation as it is today. So either we're going to cut the court backlog in 5 seconds, I don't think that's going to happen, is it? Or we have to live with the environment that we are in. If you want to catch these people and stop them raping other British kids, trafficking other foreign people into our country, causing terrible crime in our country, then we have to do the bit that means that while they're here for 7 years waiting for their bloody court case, that they don't fall out of the system. And that's hard. That is hard.
Thanks, Jess. And I'm actually delighted to hear that, because as you know, as the Centre for Social Justice and Justice in Care, we have long been advocating for longer-term support and meaningful conclusive grounds decision and support for victims to actually get their justice done and see their justice.
The tail off has never been any. I mean, I always worried about that. Even after people had 90 days reflection, it was never 90 days, was it? That's what was written down. I was always worried that they were lost. There was always a missing part of the contract, that people got lost after the step down. There needs to be but that is on the people in this room to basically design a system of step down and support that continues. That is not for governments to do. You're way better at designing stuff than us.
You can definitely count on us. And on this note, I would like to thank you, Jess, and please a huge round of applause for Jess.